Okay, so yeah, hey everyone. Definitely very excited to have this friendly conversation with Peter today about Bubble, his experience, his book, and whatever may be valuable for all of us here, regardless of on which stage of our Bubble journey we currently all are. The topics that we're going to be talking about today are super useful for anyone. People just tinkering with it, that are deep into the development of their application, maybe not the first one, or people in general sitting on a side and just hearing something that may be important later on if they choose to get started. So let's start by introducing ourselves. And before I introduce our guest Peter, let me start with introducing ourselves. My name is Vlad. I'm a co-founder of Zero Code. This is a short version of our Zero Code No Code conference that we had last year, by the way, in which Peter was starring. And I think he had one of the most interesting presentations out there, and we still are. I think we're still getting some comments and some some great takeaways from what Peter was sharing back then. I'm sure that some of it would also be presented today, because this stuff is forever. And yeah, so at Zero Code, we're doing a lot of things besides conferences and besides talking to interesting people. We are actually also building templates, building plugins, developing no-code development and educational courses, as well as creating custom applications for anyone who is interested. We've been doing this almost as much as Peter. We're on the market since 2016, and before that, we were just doing this privately on our own a little bit. So all in all, it's almost 5 years by now. So it's a lot of time, Peter. See, it feels like it was yesterday. Right.
Sure and does.
Yeah. And to introduce Peter, our guest today, Peter is the founder of Amlie Solutions. And Peter is many things. He's an avid bubbler. He's the author of the book about performance in Bubble, which we're going to be talking about a lot today. And he's a writer. He's a public speaker. And my bio says since 2016, but I'd bet it's more than that. So, but maybe we'll hear some about it today. Relatively recently, Peter has published a book, The Ultimate Guide to Bubble Performance, which I think is the most comprehensive guide I've seen so far anywhere available about the lessons learned the hard way about building the Bubble application from get-go and doing it right and paying attention to the right things while you're on it to avoid a lot of rework down the line. And we will be discussing what led to that topic to appear in the first place. How did the process go, and how did that idea evolve since the book was written? Because this is the second edition that I'm looking at right now. There may be a third one at some point. I don't know. That would be great. So Peter, welcome. Great to have you here. So what are your thoughts and plans and expectations from this conversation today?
Well, first, I just want to say hi to you, Vlad. It's very nice to see you again. It's too rare that we get to speak. And also every 98 other people in here, 100 people exactly. That's awesome. I'm really looking forward to this. First of all, I really enjoyed the conference. I got a lot of feedback after the conference. Questions, ideas, people are really open, and that's the thing I love about Bubble and the No Code. It's just this great community. I'm expecting the same thing from this meeting. I know you've also set up a competition to send in some questions, and the winners will get a free copy of the book.
Yep.
So I'm hoping we'll see some great questions as well. Other than that, I could go quickly through who I am for those who don't know me. I've been bubbling more or less the same time as you have. I started in 2016. Been bubbling more or less full-time since then. I was running a consulting agency at the time, me and some other guys, and gradually that has kind of evolved onto being more or less 100% about Bubble. So we work mainly with business software. So we're not doing the typical Bubble way of helping startups build apps, although we have done that as well, but we're typically building software that can help companies become more efficient. And for me, I think the background about the book is really, I can't claim to have invented everything that's in the book, in any way. But what I found was that in the forum, it was kind of a feeling that the forum is a fantastic community. I know you've been there a lot, and I've gotten to meet some great friends there, and people are extremely helpful in these forums. And for those who aren't active users, I really recommend, actively using it. In the beginning, I was just asking questions, and then as you got to learn Bubble, you start to see that, okay, you want to give something back. But the downside of a thing like a forum is that it's very hard to get the full picture of anything, because you have these snippets of gold. You have a fantastic thread about something that you can do about this and that. And you're like, okay, I saw that thread a week ago. Where is it now? Right. The second thing that was kind of bugging me was that a lot of complaints came into the forum, basically just saying, well, Bubble is slow, I'm quitting. Right? And they weren't really productive. I don't have a problem with people venting, and I don't have a problem with people laying out their problems and trying to find solutions. But it turned, I'm sure you remember this. It was a phase. It's not really going on in the same way anymore, I think. But about a year ago, maybe 1.5, there were a lot of these threads that went out and said, no, Bubble is too slow. It's not a serious platform. I'm quitting. And the few times that you actually got access to see what they built, you could see that, well, it's not Bubble being slow. It's your own app being slow, right? You built it in the wrong way. You did something crazy that really started slowing your app down. And these two things, just to try to gather information in one place, which in my case was a book form, and kind of poking a few myths about Bubble being slow and not slow and all of that, which led me to write the book. And of course, it was also a huge learning experience for me, because I'm sure you can relate to, when you use Bubble every day, you spend all your time in it. You make some good habits, you make some bad habits. I have plenty of both. But the book forced me to kind of put this into a system, which has helped me as a developer to see, okay, so this is how you should start out. This is what you should do. This is not worth spending your time on, and all of that. So yeah, it's been a great experience for me writing it as well.
Yeah. I have a great saying that if you want to teach something, if you want to learn something, try to teach it. That's kind of forcing you to go all the way to the very beginning, to the core foundation of the subject, and kind of make sure you really understand that, not just trying to wing it. To get to the very beginning of it, why do you think performance is such a hot topic in general? I'm not like definitely that deep into other communities other than Bubble these days, but and I'm always wondering, probably those topics one way or another also appear on a lot of different platforms which are similar in nature to Bubble itself. But to focus today our attention on Bubble specifically, why do you think this topic was coming up so frequently? I mean, you did mention that it was kind of coming in waves. Sometimes there's nothing, sometimes there's like a few people kind of chiming in together and voicing their frustration. Why do you think this was appearing in the first place for people bubbling out there?
I think there are a few reasons. One is that Bubble isn't perfect. So let's just start with what we have, just a basic platform before you build anything. Bubble is not perfect, right? They use server-side rendering of the page, which adds a little bit of time before the page actually renders. You have a constant connection with the database. There's no caching. There's no HTML files like you would see in a system like WordPress or something like that. So, Bubble does add a little bit of delay to your page load, no matter what you do.
Right.
So we could start there, and people could recognize either they just saw that it took a little bit of time, and some people who really dug into this, they could see that, okay, why is Bubble doing it this way or that way? So that, of course, sparks a few conversations where they're actually giving Bubble feedback and saying, I think you should solve this in some other way. I think you should introduce some sort of caching, And the second thing is that the flexibility that Bubble offers comes at a cost, right? And that cost is that it's very easy to mess things up. So going into Bubble, and I can say this from experience, looking at my first applications, they're a mess, right? They're a train wreck. and they're slow, and it takes 3 seconds just to do anything. And the reason is, the threshold of getting into Bubble is so low. You just start building. So very few people stop and think, how should I build this? They just start building. And it's a lot of fun. You're going to learn a lot of great stuff, but you might end up with an app that's a bit slow because you didn't really build it in an optimal way. Yeah. So, I think one of the most important but least technical aspects of the book is kind of to just say, take a breather and do some planning before you start building, because it's hard to backtrack once you've set something up the first time.
Totally. I think the first reason is actually the second reason is actually the first reason in terms of the magnitude, because no system nor no framework is perfect. There are some things which are bound to be slower than on this development language or on this platform or anywhere else, and some things are going to be faster. But I think the number one reason, and you very much nailed it, is that Bubble is so easy to get started with that most of the people who do get started have no clue what they're doing. I mean, in a good way. It's a positive thing overall, but that brings some overheads with it, meaning that you don't necessarily need to know or understand what a database is to actually create a fully functional database in Bubble, which is fantastic, right? Which is this great selling point. But on the other hand, man, that does require some thought once you get to at least something at least half serious. So I think I would wager that every bubbler that started from somewhere. Woo! My Siri wants to join the conversation. Got to a realization that I messed up pretty bad. So is there a way to kind of just tweak it and add the capacity units and just make it work faster? And there's, and most of the times there isn't. But getting to the beginning of the whole thing. So writing a book about it. So what was the toughest, let's say, chapter or the toughest component of writing a book? So what was probably a lot of things were just, as you said, nuggets of wisdom that you either have already processed yourself, got on a forum, talked to people. What was the most difficult one that later became a part of the book?
I think probably the most difficult one, was in the second edition that I released. I think it was in May, which made some updates. And one of the things I wanted to do in that update was to try and get a little bit away from specific examples and try to kind of show a framework for how you should think about it, to try to kind of catch as many app ideas as I could in one process. And that's I think in the book, I call it the data structuring process, or the data structuring chart, which is kind of a few steps, like 3-4 steps that you can go through when you're planning your database structure to see how should I plan it, right? You start with a pen and paper, and then you go through a few steps. And the last thing you do is actually to set up the data types in Bubble, right? So you should go through some steps before you're there. And to try to build that process and kind of make sense of it outside of my own head, I think that was probably the most challenging part. And I think also one of the things I wanted to touch upon, which was already there in the first edition, was to kind of try and see the psychological aspect of this as well, both from a user and a developer perspective. So try to remind people that your app is not actually slower than all other apps, right? That's a big one, actually, because people become kind of obsessed and they kind of sit like this and they time their and I can understand them perfectly well, because you want your app to run perfectly. And to try to remind people that, your performance and the way the app works is not the end of everything, right? It's not your only feature. So the fact that performance is something you can prioritize doesn't mean it should trump everything else, right? It's just one of the features that you're offering. And to find kind of a valid comparison, right? So if you search for something on Google, it's insanely fast, right? But that's the only thing Google does. They have engineers working on this 24/7, and they've been doing it for 20 years. Whereas, Bubble does thousands of things. They can't be as fast as Google on search. They probably can't handle the user base that Twitter has or Facebook has. but they will let you build an app that works stably and is pretty fast, a lot cheaper than any other platform can. So, you have to weigh these things. If you're building Twitter and you believe you will have 800 million users within the next 6 months, maybe Bubble isn't for you. But realistically, you're going to have maybe a few thousand users. And in that case, Bubble will work just fine, right?
Yeah.
So, and from the user perspective, I try also to bring in that the idea of user perceived performance, which is different ways of tricking your users into thinking that the app is faster than it actually is. And one thing that I find interesting myself, and I'm sure some readers of the book can relate to this, or you don't even have to have read the book, is that you can see these tricks all the time, right? You see them everywhere. Fancy animations, loading screens, things like that. Once you start looking, you can see that huge companies they don't have apps that are that much faster than yours. They're just really good at hiding how slow it is. So the most extreme example of that, I think, is, let's say you're using some of the bigger CRM software packages, and you want to make a change to 1,000 users. A lot of the time, you won't even see a loading bar. They will just say, "We will send you an email when it's finished."
Yeah.
Right, which means it's taking time. And it would do the same on Bubble to make change to 1,000 or 100,000 users. So Bubble is not that different from any other kind of software. It's just that we think everything happens in the blink of a second everywhere, but it's just usually the developers are really good at hiding that it actually takes some time.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
Yeah, you're actually absolutely right. So only when I started to solve that problem for the apps that we were building, okay, how do I make this faster? Or how do I at least not make it feel so slow? I suddenly mentioned all these preloading screens, elements like gray circles that are kind of flashing, giving you the sense of, okay, it's about to load, and it's everywhere, literally, like Gmail, Asana, Salesforce. I mean, don't even get me started. I mean, any application out there which is serving a decent amount of users. Social networks, I mean, that's a dire example, but even the smaller apps, which are serving relatively small amounts of people, are all doing that all the time. And I think it's actually maybe a smart thing to kind of plan for in advance. Even if your application does work fantastically fast right now, maybe you'll add that next feature, or you'll add that next 1,000 users, and then all of a sudden you'll have to figure it out. Maybe you'll have that ready in advance. Maybe that's a good thing, actually. So yeah, definitely. So performance. I mean, performance by itself is probably a big topic, and you can explore it from multiple different angles. But I guess that one of the key takeaways that I got from your book, at least, and I'm sure that a lot of other people did as well, is that database is probably one of the biggest ones of it. Meaning that, yeah, there's a lot of other ones, like the one we just mentioned, like perceived performance is not the same as the actual performance, and many other valuable things. But when I'm planning an app, when I'm thinking about an app, even when I'm talking to a person that is hypothesizing about an app, first thing that comes to my mind is, how do I structure this from the data structure point of view? Meaning, what kind of things or what kind of tables will I have? How will they be related? And how will that be affecting each and every feature that we're talking about? Essentially, in my mind, whenever I'm planning an app, creating and thinking through a smart structure of a database is probably 70% of the job in terms of optimizing for performance and actually thinking out how exactly this will work. So database is probably the foundation, or one of the definitely a super important elements of the whole thing. What's your take on that? How are you treating the database among everything else? Is that the number one thing, or do you believe that database is maybe not that important, at least from the beginning? What's your take on database in general?
It's a very wide question, because I think, we have the database. Let's say this is the database, and we can actually branch that out a little bit and see, okay, what are we working with? We're working with big amounts of data, which is stored in a database. So I think in some ways it helps to see which part, if you have a slow app, let's say your app takes 6 seconds to load, right? Which is longer than some would like. But if you have a big single page application, it could take more than that. It could take 10 seconds to load or even more. So one of the first things that you can try to do then is to kind of try to understand how much of this is actually the database. Because I think people would sometimes be surprised about how small a part of the delay is actually caused by the database, because it's actually pretty efficient. So just to take the basics, we don't need to get too technical, but just to look at, okay, how is the database built? Well, Bubble's database is not any new kind of software. They're using existing, well-proven, among the world's most used database frameworks on their database. So they didn't invent something new to build a database, right?
Right.
And they use the internal keys and the foreign keys just like any other database, except that they kind of hide this from you in the editor because you don't see the foreign keys, but it's still there, right? So just to be clear, it's not like Bubble can drastically change how they built their database structure, because it's already built on frameworks that work pretty well, right?
Yeah.
And as we know, it's hosted on Amazon. So it means, your Bubble app does not rest in a computer of the home of the CEO of Bubble, right? It's not like they can upgrade the computer and it's going to be better. They're hosted on some of the best computers in the world, right? And the database is pretty fast. It's pretty damn fast. So if you search for something, it's going to give you a result pretty fast. What I find when I go through, a coaching session or an audit on an app or something like that, is that it's actually the rendering of the data that's taking the longest time in a lot of cases. Or really anything that happens on the user's device. So one thing is the rendering, and the second thing is anything that you do with the data after it has arrived on your device, right? So if you set up some sort of advanced search filters, for example, you may be forcing Bubble to perform those filters on your device.
Right.
And that can really start to slow things down.
Oh, yeah.
It's not going to slow you down with 5 records, but if you have 10,000 of them, you may even crash your browser, right? It's
totally.
Imagine working with an Excel file where, every row is one record in your database and every column is a field on your data type. And remember, let's say you have 10,000 rows and 20 fields. Even Excel is going to start slowing down. This is a lot of data to handle. So if you're doing this on the server, you're going to get a really fast response in most cases. If you're doing it on the device, it's going to start slowing down. And one of the things that makes this a little bit difficult for people when they're building an app, even if you're professional, this is a little bit difficult, is that your app can seem very fast while you're building it because you're just one user.
Yeah.
And there's not usually that much data in it, right? So again, let's take the CRM example. I think it's a good example because it's such a wide array of things that you're doing with the CRM. You have tasks and contacts and all of that. And let's say you're building the CRM for your company. It's working really well. And then you bring users into it and you import all your contacts, and there are 20,000 of them, and you're showing every one of them in the repeating group. Again, you're gonna crash your browser, right? It's not gonna work at all, and it has nothing to do with the server, right? The search is fast. It's gonna find those users in a few milliseconds. It's gonna send a list over to you. The download, if you're downloading every one of them, may be big, but it's the rendering of 20,000 rows of information that's gonna crash your browser. Right. So it's important to emphasize this point that the database doesn't add that much usually. It's actually the rendering and everything that you do on your device that will start to slow things down.
Yeah, that's definitely a deeper take on what I said, because database in people's mind is usually, okay, everything related to the database, meaning that the server, the structure, the way things are being pulled, filtered, searched through, and sorted by. But actually database itself is responsible for a small portion of it, right? It usually is working just fine, I mean, without you actually doing anything about it. But yeah, the rendering part, definitely it's a deeper topic. I guess this is when people are saying Bubble is slow, probably 90% out of the whole, set of things people complain about, it's about them pulling the information in the wrong I would say, way, right? And storing it, first of all, in the wrong format, pulling it in the wrong way, then filtering it kind of, subpar, optimal as well. So what is, let's say, the mindset that people have to kind of explore? I think you kind of touched base on that in the book. I mean, there's a lot of like very practical questions, and some of them actually are or have already appeared in the chat, like list of things versus one too many, list of things stored on the object and things like that. But is there some sort of a paradigm that could maybe help in general for people to help the end users render the information in a better and more optimal way for let's say some of the most popular scenarios? Let's say taking that same CRM as an example, 20,000 contacts. How would you address that?
Well, the first thing I would do is not to show 20,000 contacts.
Yeah,
right?
don't do that.
It's not going to work.
It's
just not going to work, and it's
pointless anyways, right?
It's pointless, yeah. And I'm going to just quickly for a few minutes talk a little bit about how these things are rendered by your browser. Because if you work with web development, you already know this, but a lot of Bubble users, they come from something else, so they may not be aware of this. But every element that you put on your page follows a hierarchical structure. I struggle with that word, but you know what I mean, hierarchical. So which means in Bubble, you're seeing it visually, right? You have a group, and inside of that group, you have a input field or a text or whatever.
Right.
And this is a hierarchy, right? And on the left side of your Bubble screen, you're going to see this in the element tree, which actually shows you a folder structure of which elements are contained within each element. And every single element that you see there has to be rendered somehow. And what does rendering mean? Well, it means it has to calculate the coordinates of everything. It has to calculate the size of everything and place it on the screen. And then when all that is done, it actually renders every pixel on the screen. So this is a calculation that your browser does repeatedly, right? And it's not just when you load the page, it's when you scroll it, it's when you click something, animate something, hide and show groups. For each thing that you do, you have to redraw the screen and often calculate a lot of stuff. And of course, if these elements start adding up, you have a hierarchy consisting of maybe thousands of elements, it's going to start slowing down. And again, it'll be your local device that's slowing down. Your poor computer can't handle that many elements, right? So again, showing 20,000 rows, think about Gmail, right? Again, this is Google, the biggest, huge conglomerate on planet Earth.
Right. And
still, they can't show you 20,000 emails all at the same time. It wouldn't work. Yeah. There's a reason you have an inbox that's showing like 25 results or something like that, maybe 50. It's not just to keep it tidy. It's because your computer can't handle showing just an endless row of emails, right?
Right.
So the way that this usually balloons, because people might think, well, I don't add thousands of elements to my page. That's just silly. I don't do that. But the thing is, if you have a repeating group with just one element in it and you load 20,000 users, well, you have 20,000 elements, right? Yep. So it's very easy to just multiply the number of elements just by adding one single repeating group.
Yeah. Right.
So that's about the rendering. Try to keep the number of elements down. Try to understand that every app stops users from showing too many elements on the screen all at once. You have apps like Excel that can handle it, but they're built specifically for it, right? You can't expect Bubble to do the same thing, just like your CRM. Salesforce will not be able to show 20,000 contacts all at the same time efficiently. It just won't, and it probably won't let you try even. So be aware that every element that you place in a repeating group is just going to multiply and grow for every user you get into the system. And the trap is it's not happening while you're building. It's happening after you publish, right? Unless you are very serious about testing with thousands of records.
Yeah, well, so that's another topic that probably is worthy of a separate series to talk about, the testing and especially testing at scale. But
yeah.
Okay, coming back to the topic about rendering in database. So still, to answer the question, so what's better, thing to have a list with a list of child things, or to create multiple objects that would be related to that one thing, separated from it? What's your take?
I didn't quite understand your second point
Like
there.
meaning,
So
let's say a user of the social network to have a list of user posts, or like on as one of the fields on the user level, or to have multiple posts as objects that will then have a reference and backlink to the user object.
Yeah, well, I would say using lists as a performance tool doesn't help you much, really, because it's not really faster. You know, maybe you can tell a difference if there's a short list. I think searches are more or less as fast. And Bubble have said the same thing several times, that there's no noticeable difference between lists and searches. But searches give you one really important thing, which is privacy rules, right? Which is not directly related to performance, but it's still one of the most important things in Bubble that people sometimes forget, is privacy rules. And it's easy to assume that if you show a list of things that are hidden by a privacy rule, it's not going to show, but it will, right? So a list of things will show even if that thing is hidden by a privacy rule, whereas a search will never override a privacy rule. You know that your information is private. So I very rarely use lists unless I have to for some reason.
Yeah.
And there are, of course, scenarios where you'll need to use them, but for performance, no, I never do that, because I prioritize security over performance, and the performance gain is next to nothing, or maybe even nothing, right? So yeah, that's my answer for that. Don't use lists for performance. It doesn't make sense.
Definitely. I support that wholeheartedly. And actually, I would even add to that in my experience, lists are very easy to actually become detrimental for your performance overall, because depending on the use case, lists, if they get big enough, then all of a sudden you have a list of objects that has which has a list of objects. And then you think you have like 5 or 10 objects loaded to a page, but actually you have 5 or 10 objects multiplied by the amount of elements in the list of each one of these objects. And that very quickly can turn to 100 things to be loaded on your page without you even knowing. But I'm just displaying these 3 records. Why do I have such big load times? But you actually are pulling all elements from all the lists that are stored on that object, and that bloats the objects. I mean, especially if you have a few of them. And that's basically it. So the page is going to be not feeling very well, regardless of the amount of capacity units and such. So there's a very small subset of cases where you would need to use the lists, and there's next to none, basically. Yeah. To answer one of the questions, I just seen this question asked a couple of times in the chat already, and that's definitely one of the popular ones on the forum. So there you go, guys. No lists unless it's really, really necessary, and that's usually an exception.
Yeah, right. No lists for performance.
Definitely not for performance. Yeah, that's a great way to summarize it. So then, how would you then, returning back to the overall, let's say, path and mindset for people planning and kind of maybe already building and thinking about the next step for their application in terms of optimizing for performance? How do you actually plan it? Meaning, how do you plan a database? How do you plan the structure of your app? Because there's, again, lists versus one-to-many is just one of the examples of how you can accomplish like one thing in a few different ways. Same goes for, one page versus multiple pages, like one page with multiple groups versus a single page with one element that maybe just one thing. Both have pros and cons, but how do you in general recommend to approach these dichotomies, if I may?
Yeah, so there are kind of 2 questions, I think, in there. One is the structure of the database, and the second one is the structure of your app. I'm thinking we can return to the database for a little while, and I can go through the process chart that's in the book and hopefully try to shed some light on what I mean by each point here. And then we can move on to single page applications and those parts. Is that all right?
That's absolutely great.
Okay, so just let me share my screen here. Okay, where is this? There we go. Okay, so let's set this in presentation mode. There we go. Okay, so what you're seeing on the right here is Oslo, where I am right now. It's not actually that cold yet, but we're working on that.
That's the library.
It's actually, this is the Opera House. So I'm actually like 200 meters from this spot as of now.
That's nice.
Okay, so it's a digression, but let's move on. So this is the structure that I present in the book. I want to talk a little bit about these terms. For those who follow me on Twitter, you'll see that I released a few articles explaining these terms before we got in here, before this presentation, just to give those who haven't read the book kind of a primer on what I mean by this.
Right.
And these are not really community terms. They're my terms that I present in the book, but I think they're useful because we're kind of missing a language in talking about all of this. So I'm hoping these will be helpful. And if they're not helpful, I'm sure I'll hear about it. So the first thing is the concept of the data concept, which is separate from the data type. And you may wonder why we would need something called the data concept when we already have the term data type. But the way I see this is that the data concept is how your users or maybe your client see your data. And I'm going to illustrate this with an example later. But remember that a client may give you a list of requests, right? And he may tell you in the CRM that we're building, we're going to need vendors, we're going to need clients, we're going to need contacts, projects, tasks, all of that. Those are data concepts. It's the way that your users and your client think about the data. And to look into an example here, I just mentioned client and vendor, right? So these are two things that are typically present in a CRM. You have a list of clients and you have a list of vendors. Clients being someone that you do business for, and vendor being someone who does something for you or that you purchase goods or services from. And when you think about that, they're really in many ways the same thing, right? Because they are a company and you have certain fields. You have a company name, you have a phone number, email address, whatever you save on your CRM companies. So we start looking into this. You may not need two data types for this. Maybe you need just one data type called company, and we can use that and we can separate them in some other way. So we're going to look a little bit closer into that in just a second. But that's the idea behind the data concept, that the data concept is vendor and client. Okay. But the data type is company, right? And it doesn't mean that you should always do it this way. It just means that in this example, in this particular CRM, where we can agree that a vendor and client is almost the same thing, we can agree that we shouldn't have the same data type as we have data concept. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah, it does for me. And I'm sure the people in the comments will let us know should there be anything else for us to explore here, but I think it's pretty self-explanatory.
Yeah, great. By the way, I'm not really following the chat. So if you see interesting questions, could you just pop them to me? Or if you'd like me to follow the chat, I'll do that. But no. I think I'll be very distracted if I start following it.
Please, just do your thing and we'll take care of the chat. There's going to be a section towards the end of the discussion when we will skim through the chat and pick the most interesting questions. There's already quite a few that I see and people are really, really active in the comments. Thank you guys. You're amazing. Let's go continue with the data concepts.
All right. Okay, so that's data concept. It's just the mental version of your data, whereas the data type is Bubble's version of the data, which can be more data types. It can be just one data type. It doesn't matter. And as for data weight, it's basically exactly what it sounds like. It's just how heavy is a data type, and how heavy a data type becomes, you can measure by basically the download size and how slow it's going to be to search for it. Right. So if we're talking about, the easiest way to separate a heavy and a light data type, or a data type with a low data weight and a heavy data weight, is to look at the amount of unstructured data that it contains. So structured data is any data that it's structured. So the phone book on your phone is a typical example, right? Because you have first name, last name, phone number, email, all of these fields. They would fit into an Excel sheet just fine. That is structured data. It's usually very easy to search through. You have very set field types for each one of them. You know, you have text, number, whatever you place in there, maybe an address.
Right.
Those are lightweight fields and they're structured data. You can't, once you set them up, you can't really change them. You can't force text into a number field, for example, and it's lightweight. And unstructured data is any kind of data that wouldn't really be readable by a computer. So that means, for example, a newspaper article, which is also saved in the database, right? It's all part of the same Excel sheet somewhere. You have all these articles, and this is not fast to search through because Bubble doesn't really understand what the data is. It just knows it's a text, and it can quickly add up to a lot of data over time.
Right.
So, for example, if you write a long article, let's say something like 10,000 words, and let's say that article turns into 10 kilobytes, something like that, that's not a big size, right? But when you start talking about a lot of records, you download 1,000 articles, you're suddenly downloading tens or hundreds of megabytes, right? So unstructured data is not very search friendly because it can add a lot of data to each data type or each record in the data type. So sometimes it makes sense to separate the two, as we'll see afterwards. The third thing here, which we'll go through in the chart, is what I call data type requirements, and those requirements may lead to something called a data type conflict. And this is just really asking a data type, if you will, what are your requirements? What do I need from this data type?
Right.
And I don't mean first name, last name, and email. That's not what I mean. What I mean is, what does this data type require in my final app? So let's say you are building a blog, for example, and you have two data types. No, sorry, you have one data type called article, which contains a lot of unstructured data because it stores a full article, right? And maybe even more. Maybe it stores a lot of comments. What do I know? A lot of data. And you also need this data type to be searchable efficiently. Users are going to keep searching for articles all the time. So that would be, we have two requirements. The data type needs to contain a lot of data, unstructured. And we also need the data type to be searchable fast, right? So those two, they're in conflict, right? We can't have a data type that's both data heavy, it has a high data weight, and it also needs to be very efficiently searchable. Those two are competing with each other. And that's where we'll introduce this fourth term here, which is called the satellite data types, which are extra data types that you set up in order to overcome these conflicts.
Right.
And this brings us to the chart. So this is not the chart, this is the chart. So I'm trying to illustrate here where this thing happens, right? So at this point, when we're talking about the data concept, remember the data concept is whatever your user sees in the system, client or a vendor or user, contact, project, task, all of these are data concepts. This is all in your brain so far, right? This is the idea. You're thinking about it. The app is not set up yet. And when we move into the concept of data type requirements, we're on the pen and paper stage still. This is one of the dangers of Bubble, is that you shouldn't use Bubble as a notepad, right? It's easy to think that, okay, these are the data concepts. I need clients, vendors, and contacts. And you set up those three data types, right? You just do, because you have to remember this, and it's just a good idea, and it feels very efficient. But what I'm hoping to show here is that it's not always the best way to go, because you may be ignoring requirements that these data types have.
Right.
So moving on from mapping out the requirements, we're actually setting up the data types after that, and any eventual satellite data types that may be needed. So looking at this a little bit more closely, let's take the CRM example again. So we have a client, we have a vendor. We're still in the brain, right? We're still just thinking about how our app should look. This is what your client is drawing on the whiteboard and says, we need clients and vendors. Again, don't put this into your database just yet, because the next step we're going to do is that we're going to specify the requirements for these. And this is when you both start to draw out what these data types or data concepts will need, in terms of fields, right? They need first name, last name, or in this case, company name, email, phone number, everything that you need to store on this. And also, how do you need them to be searchable? And at this point, we're starting to see, you're kind of, oh, wait a second, these are almost the same thing. They're, they're both companies that have all these fields in common. Does it really make sense to set up two data types? And you may get a realization trying to be one step ahead of your client. You may suddenly realize that, well, a client could be a vendor, right? You could buy and sell something to the same company. It happens all the time, which means, again, if you have separate data types, I'm getting a headache just thinking about how you would have to organize that, right? If they were separate. So keeping them as one makes it a lot easier. Going through this process here, following these arrows, we can see that, okay, we can actually merge these to one data type called company instead, right? And if we take this process a little further, let's go back to our example from earlier where we talked about one data type having a high data weight and a second data type having a low data weight. So in this case, let's assume for this CRM that on each company, you have to save a lot of data. Let's say you have long notes for each company, for example. So a lot of different fields, making this to be a pretty data heavy data type. In this case, we might want to introduce a satellite data type, which is a data type that supports the other one to solve a requirement conflict. The conflict here being that we both want to search and we want to store a lot of data, like we talked about earlier. So in that case, we may want to add a satellite data type to this that's just called company search, for example. We could call this a search container, and we can call this the database container, or the data container. And those serve two different purposes. So the first data type that we set up, this one, company, is there to store all the data, right? Whereas this one is a really lightweight. It only contains two things. It has two requirements. It contains the data needed to return a search result. So if you're searching only for company name, for example, it could potentially just include that single field, right? Name. And the second thing is that it needs all the data that you want to show in the search results, right? So if you search for a company, you may want to present a list that includes, company name, phone number, website, what do I know, something like that, which you would also have to include with this, right? So in your app, then you would have two data types. The first one would be the data container, which contains all the data that you're saving on the company. The second one would be the search data type, which contains only what you need to efficiently search for it. So here's how that process would look. Your user is searching for a company. He types something in like Acme company. Bubble returns a list of this data type, which lists, let's say you have 5 companies that match the search. When you click this, it takes you to the edit form or the view details or whatever. Then you're loading this one, right? And the high data weight doesn't matter if you're only loading one record, right? It only matters when you're downloading a long list of records. So downloading search results with this one could slow your app down, whereas just downloading this very light one to show the results and then transferring the user over to the full data container afterwards will be faster, right? And this is how we can see that we took this through. In the beginning of this, we had 2 data types. That's what we thought. We had client and vendor, and then we reduced that to 1 data type, and then we're actually back to two data types in the end. And the client and the user has no clue, right? So that's why we need the data concept, is because the user and the client has no idea that these two exist. All he can see is clients and vendors. And the way we would likely separate these is to use an option set, right? So a company can be a client. It has a field called company type, client, or vendor, these two being option sets. We could also make that a list, which can only ever contain two things. So it could contain client or vendor, or client and vendor,
right?
Which would help us filter these, right? If you want these to be, if you want one company to be able to be both, we could do that. So that's a good use case of lists also.
Definitely. Yeah.
So I hope that was clear.
Yeah, definitely. It's a great way to give terms to all these definitions. I think it's very valuable, and if Bubble didn't adopt that just yet, they probably should, because I feel that a lot of power users on Bubble are doing a lot of these things, and maybe they're not even defining that as an existing concept. I'm guilty of that, because I'm doing this all the time with blog posts, for example. So if there's a piece of software that has a number of blog posts, usually the way that, let's say, a novice bubbler would approach that, you would just make a repeating group of blog posts in which you then have to click on one blog post, and then that blog post would open, let's say, in a different page. But because blog posts tend to get big, sometimes there are pictures, there's like rich text formatting, there may be comments, as you correctly said. That repeating group with 10 blog posts is actually heavy as hell at some point, especially if the blog posts are, somewhat at least medium in size. And if there's more, and there's usually more, it gets, it's downhill from there. So what we usually do is we create a blog post and the blog as two different database objects, which is the data type and the satellite data type. And you actually list and search for the smaller one, which only contains the main picture, the name, maybe some tags for that to be searchable. And when you click on that, it actually has a backlink to the bigger blog post, which may be 10 megs on its own. But yeah, you don't care, because you just load one thing and off you go. So definitely a great concept, very applicable to a lot of cases, specifically when you need to search for data, list for data, and and other more functional things. Like you said, notes are a great example. So you don't really need to store notes as part of the one and the same object. I mean, probably you never should, unless it's like a one-liner. If it's a list of notes or comments or anything more than like 5 or 10 things that you need to store for one object, store them as satellite data types, satellite objects that would be disconnected from the object, but easily linkable and searchable to it. Another great example of it is a comment to a post in a social network, right? So there's a social network post, which is an object on its own, and there are comments. There may be like thousands of comments, or like even more, like tens of thousands of comments. You definitely don't want to store them as part of the one and the same object. That will be the end of it.
And an important lesson here, which not everyone knows, is that at least in what Bubble is today, they may change this in the future, but as of now, Bubble will download all the data even if you're not showing it, right? Yeah. So if you're showing a repeating group with just the blog post titles, for example, you may think that that's very lightweight because you're only showing the title. And yeah, sure, the rendering is lightweight because you only have one element, but you're still downloading the full blog post of every record that you're downloading. So that can really add up over time. Another interesting use case for this, I'm gonna just hit the internet here for a second. You can still see my screen, right?
Yes.
Let's go into something like TripAdvisor. Okay, they value my privacy. That's nice. Okay, so I'm gonna search for something here. Let's say, okay, so right now I'm looking at the search result on TripAdvisor. So it finds Oslo, which is the town. It finds something called Guldsmeden Hotels, the Oslo Fjord, which is nice. And a lot of different things here. They have tours and tickets. They have all these kinds of things. And this is also an example where a satellite data type can actually be applied to multiple data types. So if we go back to this one,
right.
Let's get away from the CRM a bit and just pretend that we're building TripAdvisor.
Okay.
So these may be restaurant, hotel, city, whatever you need to store and show. And you want to show everything in one search result. So if you have 5 different data types, hotel, restaurant, city, country, whatever they are, you would have to place one search and one repeating group to show on top of each other for each of those data types.
That's
it's not very efficient.
Yeah.
Right? Whereas if you build one satellite data type that applies to each one of them, you could force that into one search.
Kind of like
right?
index, right?
Kind of like an index, yeah. So which fields you need to store in that would be, again, just what you need to search for it and to display it. So going back to TripAdvisor here, it's probably what they've done here. I'm guessing they're not performing 5 to 10 different searches here. They just have some sort of index that can show one list of results. The way you would do this is that you take, let's say these are not data concept, they're data types. This is hotel and this is country. You would just create one satellite data type, again, a search container, which links to the original one, right? And there can be several upsides to doing this. One thing is that you can search for anything and get it presented in the same list. But another thing is that you can load it on, let's say you have a page thing. You want to load these results always on the same page.
Right.
You can actually load this thing instead of this thing, which means you don't need to have a page called hotel and one called restaurant and one called country and one called, you don't need 5 different pages that you need to maintain. You just need one page called results. And you can just load the search representative, which links to this one, right? So that's another use case for a satellite data type where you think about search in a very light data type that can be connected to one or more of your existing data types.
Yeah, it's actually pretty smart. I've seen people doing that same use case in a lot of crazy ways, like stacking repeating groups on top of one another that would actually facilitate all of the necessary data types. I mean, and that works up to a certain extent, but yeah, until it doesn't. So that's definitely a smarter way to approach it.
And how did I find that out? Well, I did what you said, right? I placed 3 to 5 different repeating groups on top of each other, and it's not very efficient. I was performing 5 searches on every page load. It's not a good idea, right? So this is definitely going to speed things up. Yeah.
That didn't work for me either. I did that quite a few times too. All right, Peter, we have a ton of amazing questions. And because we promised we're going to go through all of them and select the few ones that are going to be to your best liking, let's spend some time on going over the ones that we didn't yet cover with what you were telling us about, because we did cover a few, but then there are other ones that are also interesting to hear your opinion on. So starting from the very beginning, let me try to pinpoint the most interesting ones. Here's a good one. Peter, what would you do different with Bubble if you would have to start again from scratch, like from the very beginning? I guess that what's meant is that you already have a name, a company, a set of customers that trust you and that know your capabilities. You have your software, you have your book. What would you do if you would had to operate under a different name today? What would be your first thing to kind of try and establish and go with? Knowing what
that's an interesting question. And if I knew what I know now, I wouldn't make all the thousands of mistakes that I made, which would be really nice. But I had to make those to get here, I guess, up until this point at least. I think I'm gonna move a little bit away from the Bubble sphere and more over to work in general. I think No Code and Bubble have this amazing thing about it that you can build almost anything on your own, right? And that is in most ways a fantastic thing. You have an app idea and you can actually build that in a few weeks on your own. But it also has a sort of isolating effect. And it has a tendency to lure you into overworking yourself and isolating yourself for too long. And for those who follow me on Twitter, I shared this a few weeks back that I definitely worked too hard, pushed myself too far, isolated myself sitting in front of the screen, watching the Bubble editor for 10 to 15 hours per day, way too long. I would not do that again. I would never go back to working my ass off just to, thinking that productivity was the only thing that mattered.
Right.
I'm not sure this is the answer that people wanted. I know they wanted me to talk about bubble, but I would just say this: get away from the screen sometimes, see your family, see your friends, and don't think that productivity is the only thing that matters, because it really isn't.
Amen to that. Yeah, that's definitely, I think that's actually bigger than bubble. So definitely thank you very much for that answer. And I think there should be people who need to hear this first. Right. There's quite a few more. Let's go over these. Here's a quick one. That's not necessarily related to bubble. Did you buy Bitcoin?
Oh, here's the thing. I bought Bitcoin when a friend of mine had a baby. I bought the Bitcoin as a gift to his newborn son. His newborn son is no longer newborn, but he's rich and I'm not. So yeah, he made a lot of money on that. I didn't make a cent. So I do not own Bitcoin, no, but I have bought it in my life.
Technically, yes. You did buy it.
At the time, it was worth very little.
That was a smart move.
I'm sure he's happy about it.
Yeah. That's what friends are for, right? Great.
Exactly. Yeah.
There's a couple of questions
of college fund.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, maybe more. Who knows how this unfolds? There's a few questions of similar nature that are asking about how do you plan ahead efficiently if you do not really know where your product is going? What's your advice on that? That's a tough one, actually.
It is tough. I think I would have to split that into two, because if I work with a client, I plan it out in detail, because people who are listening who work in an agency or as a freelancer on their own, they will discover eventually that if there's a disagreement between you and the client about what was being built, it's going to take a shitload of time to agree on that and to build what the client expects. And so, for clients, I'm pretty precise about what I'm building. And if it's not in the plan, I'm not building it. It sounds a bit strict, but it has to be that way, really. But for my own projects, I'm pretty hopeless, to be honest. I'm just like everyone else. I'm like, oh, I want to have this feature in there. So I preach that people shouldn't do that, but I do that myself a lot of the time. And I have personal projects that are just endless projects. I enjoy working on them. They never seem to go live. Because I'm not really planning those in the same way. And I think, part of the reason for me is that I love Bubble. I think it's just so much fun to create stuff on it. I create apps to, manage my personal life, to manage clients. I do all of that stuff. It's not necessarily public stuff. It may just be something that never goes public.
Right.
But I think it doesn't feel as much like work if I don't plan it out as work. So it's more fun to do it that way. But yeah, I'm a hopeless case when it comes to personal projects, really.
That's the win, actually. Someone smart told that. I think it was Naval said that, find something that feels like work to you. Sorry, feels like work to them and feels like play to you. So they will never be able to outcompete you in something that feels like play. So definitely, I think Bubble is that for a lot of people. So a good point.
I think it's not really related to planning, but I think one of the things that I had to drop early on was if you're working with a client and you're delivering something, you want to over deliver, you want to present something to the client, and you start building stuff that you never really agreed upon just because you feel that, well, it should be there. It would be really great if it was there and my client would be really happy. And often you don't realize how much time that can eat up from your schedule, right? I'm just going to add this one thing and it takes you 7 hours and suddenly a full workday is gone. So build what you agreed, and you can suggest features later in an upcoming sprint or whatever, but stick to the plan for clients. I would say that as an important piece of advice.
Experience speaking here, definitely. And not to speak about maintaining that feature later on, then all of a sudden you find that to actually, keep it working, you need to do double, triple extra work on the other features that would otherwise be a breeze. So definitely, in most of the cases, that's a no-go. Okay, there's another set of questions about potentially using external databases with Bubble. such as Xano or Airtable, like to maybe figure out the data structure prior to get it done, or maybe visualize it. There are tools out there which are helping to do that, or just for the sake of speed. Maybe some people are straight ahead connecting MySQL or other more traditional stacks to Bubble and trying to play with that. What's your experience with it? Would you advise it for some purpose, and or would you mostly stick to Bubble for handling the data, unless there's some advantage that you maybe are aware of or can suggest?
Yeah. So first thing I'd say is that my experience on this is pretty limited. So I don't want to pretend to be an expert on that field at all. What I would say is that using SQL, for example, is something that I have experienced can be more trouble than it's worth. It's more complex than most people anticipate. And if you have a lot of experience doing that, well, I'm sure you can do that efficiently. But for me, I'm not an SQL expert by any means. So for me to kind of try to do that would take a lot of research, and I'm trying and failing before I could set it up. So it's not the first place I would go to, at least from a performance perspective.
Right.
But something like Airtable is again, most people who set up Airtable, I don't think they're doing it for performance really. I think they're doing it because Airtable has features that you may need,
Yep.
So instead of building forms and stuff, you can use Airtable as a more efficient way of maintaining the data in your app. There are all sorts of use cases for that. I know a lot of people have done it with great success. Again, I don't think they're doing it for the performance. I think they're doing it to get access to Airtable's feature set, really.
I agree. And my experience is very similar, that a lot of times it seems like it's going to be saving you time, but in the end of the day, it's just another element that contains crucial part of your application that you are communicating via the API instead of doing it all in-house. And changing a data point, adding a field, removing a field just breaks everything. So it's unless it's really necessary. The real use case that I know that would be a valid one for that is let's say, for example, if you are obliged legally to store a data in a specific shape and form, like in a specific country or geographic location otherwise, then there's pretty much no other option other than, there's the set of options is limited, but this is not the topic of performance. And in most cases, one notable exception, by the way, is Algolia. This thing actually helps a ton with difficult queries and overall speeding up your searches, but that's a topic for another discussion, I guess. But Algolia is good, so that's a good alternative.
I'll just throw one thing in there before people go down the Algolia rabbit hole, is that Algolia really is for public data, right? Because it doesn't respect privacy rules. There's a limited amount of conditions and filtering and all of that. So if you're for something like IMDb or Spotify, it would be great, right? You can it's lightning fast and it doesn't take up your capacity. It's a fantastic tool. It's not for a CRM. It's not for any kind of private data. Just wanted to add that before people spend a lot of time going into it.
Yeah, good point. Okay. Famous question about all right, actually you did answer that already about the constraints and the filters. Let me see the next best one. Okay, so here's the one about the rendering and about one-pagers. So much of, I'm quoting a person asking that. Person's name is Jason. Jason is asking, much of what you're stating is that rendering an element and structure causes poor performance. If you created a single page app with many conditionals and elements that are hiding and showing and displaying data in different conditions, what steps would you take to determine how to improve the page load speed if breaking into multiple pages might be a solution? So yeah, I guess that coming back to the question of one pager versus multiple pages per function or per group. How would you address that?
Yeah, it's good that this question come up because I kind of forgot to move into that section earlier when we talked about it. So there's a couple of things I'd like to try to unwrap in there. The first thing is that we tend to get a little bit caught up in page load times in terms of you hear something that Google says, they say that, well, your conversion rate will go down 30% if you add 1 second of load time to your app, right? And Amazon say the same thing. I'm just making up numbers now, but we've all heard these things. We know how important they are and so on. But that doesn't really, it's not really necessarily relevant for your application. So if you're building, I love this example of the CRM because it contains so much different data.
Yep.
A CRM is a typical thing that as a one-page app could become potentially pretty heavy. Because let's say you have a sidebar here where you have clients, vendors, contacts, projects, tasks, and all of these are loading without any page reload. So you have everything in one single page application.
Right.
So you could ask yourself a question here. First is, how much will my users mind that the page takes a little time to load? You know, and how can I distract them from that fact? Right. So if you have a nice looking loading screen with a quote from a famous businessman randomly showing up while it's loading, people are actually may not care that much. And the second thing is that with a single page application, you're loading it once, hopefully, per day, right? You come in, you turn on your computer, it takes 10 seconds to load, and then you're using it for 8 hours that day. You don't need to reload it, right? So in that way, don't think about the page loads time as, you know, a catastrophe. And I've built this in internal systems myself where I can see that it's loading pretty slowly. The initial page load is slow, right? It could take, I haven't measured it, let's say 10 to 15 seconds, something like that.
Yeah.
And the reason it's slow is that in that particular case, I was actually showing a loading screen, which is in front of everything else on the screen. And in the meantime, I'm loading every kind of list and even rendering it on screen underneath a pop-up. And what does this mean? Well, it means it's going to take a hell of a long time to load the page. But once you've loaded it, it's really fast, right? Because everything is already rendered and in place. So I'm showing something in front of him, like a pop-up. The whole page, every section, contacts, projects, tasks, everything is rendered in a 20,000 pixel screen. The user can't see it. And then when the pop-up disappears, everything is loaded. I can click my way down the menu. Everything is just instant. And the reason was I told myself, okay, I can live with a long initial page load, but I want the rest of the app to be really fast. Because I was annoyed that I was going from contacts to projects and you see this spinning wheel loading all the projects and it takes forever. I didn't want that. I wanted it to be really snappy. That is one way to go. It doesn't mean it's the right way. It's just for that particular project, that was what I wanted. So I could live with that initial page load time. So to get back to the question from the viewer here, building a single page application, the way I would think about it is that there are a lot of upsides to using it. Again, the navigation can be blazingly fast. People kind of expect it in some cases that if you click a sidebar menu and you reload a new page every time, it's a bit annoying, right?
Yeah.
But what I would plan out is, okay, what needs to be in this page or on this page, and what can I place somewhere else? And the way to think about this is, what will my users access frequently? And a typical thing that they don't access frequently is settings, editing their user profile, stuff like that. They'll do it sometimes, but they're not going to do it all the time. I would think about, okay, place those things on another page. You can have a settings page, you can have a my profile page, so you don't have to load those. Just keep those out of there. But the things that they frequently use, that's part of their everyday workflow, you keep on the same page. And one example that I use in the book, which is a kind of extreme example of separating different kinds of tasks, is again Google, right?
Right.
When you load Gmail and you click the apps icon and then you click Google Calendar, it's going to open up in a new window and it's on a separate page. And I suspect that they're doing this because it helps Gmail load really fast. Whereas if Gmail was a single page application that also contained the calendar, it also contained Google Drive, it also got all these things, it would take 20 seconds, 30 seconds to load, right?
Yeah.
So single page applications, I do not avoid them. I like them quite a bit. I think they're so fast to work with, and it's the way to go for a lot of software as a service applications. But just remove everything that you don't need in your everyday workflow, or that your users need in your everyday workflow. So
makes a lot of sense. Okay, we have time. We're actually over time, but there's a lot of questions. So let me try to summarize the last one. There were a couple of similar nature, and they're mostly about scale. So there was a question about what's the biggest application you are aware of, or that you have faced with that is working on Bubble, that you're basically can say, yeah, I've seen that app. And there's another similar question about what would you do with like a database of 100K up records of a satellite data type in a database? Like, would really Bubble be able to handle this amount? I mean, at this level, or is that basically kind of already a gray territory, and there should be some sort of a different approach to be had once you're in there? Like, generally scale, how good at Bubble, how good are those principles when we are talking about hundreds of thousands, maybe, or maybe just dozens of thousands even?
Yeah, it's a broader question than can be answered, in a quick response. Sure. I think one of the reasons is, for example, what kind of performance are you looking for? Because there are plenty of examples, and some of them are just set up as example apps that are available on the forum. I can't remember the name of the thread, but where you have a demo app where someone has just put up automation of creating records in a data type,
right,
until they're in the millions, right? And searching through those, it's like this, right? So Bubble can handle millions of records. We're seeing that, and we know that it does. But if you want to make changes or work with the data, frequently updating it and all of that through millions of records, Bubble is going to be pretty slow. And I think the fastest tool that we have at our disposal today to make changes to a lot of records is to use recursive workflows, right? So you can set those up. You can experiment with how much time to spend in between them. Just quickly, a recursive workflow is a workflow that does something and then it schedules itself,
right, and
it does it again, right? So you can move through a list in kind of this circular motion, and when it's done, it just doesn't reschedule. So those are set up in the back end. And the way you would do this, let's say you want to change the first name of 1 million users, you would set up, the first action would be change the name of the user. The second action would be schedule a new cycle, schedule itself, remove the user you just worked on from the list, and move on to user number 2, right? So you now have 999,999 records left. And when you schedule the second step, you put a slight delay there, right? So it makes the change on the user, it reschedules itself, and you place a slight delay. And the reason you want that delay there is that you don't want your capacity to go through the roof. Because if you don't have any delay, Bubble will just try to work its way through this as fast as it can.
Right.
And, San Francisco will blow up, right? Yeah. So I think, for a small change like this, like changing the first name of 1 million users, you could probably get away with having just 1/10 of a second in between those cycles. So it performs the work, it waits for 1/10 of a second, and then it starts again on the next record in the list. But 1/10 of a second, when we're talking about 1 million records, is still a long time. Yeah. So I'm not gonna try to calculate that, but it's gonna take a long time, right? And if you're making bigger changes than this, you might have a full second between them, or even several seconds. So that's where you'll find, yes, you can search through millions of records really fast, but you can't change the first name of 1 million users really fast.
Right. So basically,
you're going to get stuck. Yeah. So, it's difficult to cover all scenarios, but those two are both related to performance, but they're very different questions, if that makes sense.
Totally.
So again, you may solve these issues by moving outside of Bubble, using API services to make those changes. But again, then I like to stick within the Bubble framework when we're talking about this, really, because that's what people are, especially new users, are comfortable using, right?
Yeah, definitely. That's already a pro pro move when you're using SQL for partially or fully handling your data or something like that. Definitely. All right. I believe that's all we really have time for, and even more than that. So, Peter, thank you very much for all the thorough answers. I saw people leaving a lot of great wishes. A lot of them actually own your book and are very thankful for you taking your time to write it, to speak about it today, to speak about it always. I think it actually is one of the key takeaways from the forum that I found in the recent year or so. Definitely a great resource for me and for all the people that are looking for building on Bubble. Before we proceed with the selection of our winners, how can people get in touch with you? Where do they find you? And what kind of questions do you usually are happy to talk about some more besides performance? We got that on for sure today.
Yeah, so I'm pretty available. You'll find me on Twitter. You'll find me on the forum. You can contact me via my website on amliesolutions.com. And I don't think I ever don't respond, even though it can take a little bit of time. But if you have a specific question or a vague question or just want to say hello, I'm pretty accessible. Yeah. So I'm not a huge social media guy. I don't have an enormous Twitter following or anything like that, but I'm learning. I'm working on it.
Yeah.
So if you want to help me out on that part, feel free to contact me on Twitter as well. I see that's where all the kids are, so I have to stay there, I guess.
Yeah. Kids are on TikTok, man. You'll have to be very creative to talk about Bubble performance on TikTok.
I'm not going there.
I believe in you. All right. And yeah, for the people who joined us a little late, the recording for the whole conversation with Peter will be available on our YouTube channel. So if you missed some parts of it, don't worry. You'll get a chance to revisit all of that. So
can I add one thing just about getting in touch? Yeah. If you have a great question that other people may be interested in, I would encourage you to share it either on Twitter or on the forum so that other people can see it as well, because it all helps to build the repository of answers available. And other people may chip in and disagree with what I'm saying, right? So you may get new perspectives as well.
I feel that there's a third edition of your book coming really soon. Maybe a fourth one as well at some point in the future. So definitely ask questions, people. We could use all of that for sure.
Yeah.
I
feedback on the book is also very welcome.
Awesome. So Peter, let's proceed with the selection of the questions. So which questions come to your mind when you're thinking about today and the ones that we went over? What are the top three?
Oh, that's it's difficult to respond to, actually, because I kind of forgot the questions now that we've gone through them. I think the one about single page application, I think, is a great question, because I think it's one of the early decisions that you have to make. So I think it really makes sense that people are aware that you should do some planning before you start setting that up. And you should know the pros and cons of going the SPA route. I think that was a good question. I personally enjoyed the question about, what would you do differently? Because I just think this is an undercommunicated topic that people should know about, that work is not everything. What about you? A third one? Did you have a favorite?
I think a Bitcoin was nice.
Sorry?
Bitcoin question was nice.
Oh yeah. Telling my tragic Bitcoin story.
Yeah, that was actually, that's a good one. I would I urge you to talk more about this, because I'm sure a lot of people can relate in some way.
Everyone has a Bitcoin story.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, I think that's a great way to end this conversation. Peter, thank you so much one more time. For the folks who had a chance to ask their questions and be selected by Peter, our marketing team will contact you after this session, maybe tomorrow, but we definitely will. So thank you very much for helping us out. Please get in touch with us over Twitter, in YouTube, and definitely right now we've shared the email address for where you can drop your contact details so we can get back to you. Otherwise, great conversation, great evening. Peter, thank you very much for your time and valuable inputs, and talk to you all soon.
Yeah, thank you so much, Vlad.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.